Your attendance tonight. It's really great to be together on midweek Bible study. I started the morning out in Tennessee this morning. Jason Pullum and Hunter and I were blessed to be able to attend Freed Arteman Lectures Monday through Wednesday, and just had a wonderful time meeting a lot of people, being with a lot of brothers and sisters in Christ, and hearing a lot of really instructional lessons, edifying lessons, spiritually uplifting lessons. We got to see Allison Taylor, who's a student up there, and Kyle Wilkerson. And last night, I got to hear Kyle sing in the chorale. They called it Sunshine Singers when I was a student there. They've come up in the world. They are more elite now with Kyle's group, but they sang beautifully, and proud of Kyle and Allison and what they're doing there, and made a fast rush back here so I could be with you this evening. So I'm glad to be home. I'm going to try to be as energetic as I can. We'll see how that goes. We are continuing our thoughts on the apostles, and we're ready for the Apostle John. And if I had to pick a favorite, it'd be the Apostle John. He's just wonderful. And what you see in John is this amazing transformation. I'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to say that we know the most about the apostles who wrote the most. Which apostle do you know the most about, really? Who do you feel that you know? Peter and Paul, right? Peter is involved in the gospel accounts. There's more descriptions about him in the gospel accounts, and he wrote 2 epistles. And Paul, is one of the main characters in the book of Acts, as is Peter, and Paul wrote 13 books. And that's why we know a lot about Peter and Paul. And we know a lot about John also, because John wrote 5 books of the New Testament. 4 of them, if you don't know them, you need to just look at the table of contents in your New Testaments, because these are easy test questions. Name 4 books written by John. Let's see, John, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And then he also wrote, what's the last one? Book of Revelation. And when people first learn that, they're so surprised, because they say, the book of Revelation is so different from John's other writings. But there are a lot of similarities. The big difference is the style in which he's writing. Revelation is written in a very specific literary style called apocalyptic literature. The vehicle of that is signs, symbols. And that's what makes it different. The themes are the same. John's black and white approach, light versus darkness, good versus evil, it's all there. John is a very good writer. These personalities of these men, the reason we know them from their writings is the process of inspiration doesn't eliminate personality or style. I don't know how that works, but I know that's what the Bible teaches about it. It doesn't say that when the Holy Spirit inspired men to write the Bible, those men turned into like typewriters for God. That it was like mechanical dictation. Their styles and personalities somehow come out in the writings. And that's why when you read Luke and Acts, you see a lot more medical terminology than you see in the other books of the New Testament. Luke was a physician. That's why Paul's letters are the most emotional and free-flowing of all the books of the New Testament. That's why Mark is very brief, but very detailed. And that's why John writes the way that he writes. Of the New Testament writers, I think John is the poet. A lot of people would say, well, Paul is the poet. But Paul is more of a memoirist or speechwriter or something like that. John is the poet. Now, a lot of people get confused on that because they think poems have big words I can't understand. That's not the definition of a poem. Poems say things that you can't say in plain language. That's what poems are. And they can use short words, or they can use big words. Now, John is characterized by a very simple vocabulary. You've probably heard me use this illustration before, but when I started studying Greek at Fried-Hardeman in undergrad, I thought when we started translating the Bible, we start with Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to translate the New Testament. Let's start at the beginning of the New Testament. But that's not where we started. We started with 1 John. And my instructor said, you're not ready for Matthew, and you're not ready for Paul, and you're not ready for Luke, and you're not ready for Hebrews. Those are the most complicated vocabularies. He said, we start with John because John uses the simplest vocabulary and grammar. And sure enough, that was the case. You could have a smaller vocabulary and be able to translate John. And you don't have to know Greek to know that. You can go to John chapter 1, verse 1. Count the words you don't know in this sentence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Those words, beginning is the longest word in that. Most of them are one syllable, 4-letter or less words. So, simple vocabulary, right? Simple meaning? No, what does that mean? I mean, he takes these little words and he puts them together in mind-blowing ways. We'll study, I think in 2 weeks, Nathaniel. John is the only one, aside from listing things about him, John's the only one that tells us much about Nathaniel. And this is just another example. Jesus comes to Philip, and Philip meets Jesus much in the same way Andrew meets Jesus. And so Philip, like Andrew, was impressed, so he runs to tell Nathaniel, which makes us think that perhaps Nathaniel and Philip were brothers the way that Peter and Andrew were brothers. And so he finds Nathanael and he says, we found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael's coming towards him. And Jesus says, an Israelite indeed in whom there is no deceit. And Nathanael says, how do you know me? Now this is just an example of John's style in this next verse. I'm reading John chapter 1, verse 48. Here's what John tells us Jesus said. Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now I understand the words, but I have no idea fully what's involved in that. Think about what John revealed and what he left out. So Jesus saw Nathanael before Philip called him, which means they were not in the same vicinity. So Jesus had a miraculous vision of Nathanael under a fig tree. But why was that detail under the fig tree significant? I walk under trees all the time. I mean, he might have said to me, I saw you when you were under the oak tree. Which oak tree? I don't know what you're talking about, oak tree. But this was something going on personal to Nathanael. And only Jesus and Nathanael knew. And they had a moment there. And I bet John knew what Nathanael was doing under the fig tree and exactly what Jesus meant by saying, I saw you under the fig tree, and a lot of other things that he chose under inspiration to leave out. And for me, that makes Nathanael somehow more special than if I knew all the details. I don't know if that's true with you, but that's why I think it's poetic, because by leaving out details and not telling us every little thing and answering all our questions, we have a chance to discuss for centuries what Nathanael was doing under the fig tree. And that's how John writes. When I taught John here, it's been years ago, I took 2 quarters to do it. And a lot of our discussions were just about what was happening between the lines. And it caused us to meditate more and to converse. And those details made a greater impact on our souls as a result. That's John's style. I might tell you a little bit about his personality. He was a deep thinker and a great communicator, but he didn't start out like that. I don't have slides today, but if I had a slide up, my cover slide on John would say, John, the Apostle of Love. That's probably the nickname you would choose for him, right? He was called the one Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's how he refers to himself throughout the gospel according to John. And how many times in the epistles of John does he say, love one another? But he didn't start out like that. In fact, he started out as the apostle of intolerance. That's really how he began. I hope that you were able to be here last week when we talked about James. Everything we said about James last week applies to John, because everything except for James's death, every detail we have about the life of James when he followed Jesus, John was included in that. It was always James and John did this, James and John did that. Boanerges, it's not son of thunder. That nickname for James was sons of thunder, because John was alongside James in that. That request, Jesus, you want us to call fire down from heaven and consume all of these people in the Samaritan village? That wasn't just voiced by James, it was James and John who asked Jesus if he would like for them to call down fire from heaven to consume Samaritans. That request, Jesus, grant that we may sit on your right hand and on your left when you come into your kingdom. That was not a request made just by James, but by James and John. The intolerance, the bloodthirstiness, the anger, the rage, the prejudice, the ambition, that was John as well as James. That was the beginning of the apostle of love. The apostles are a great glimpse at what Jesus can do with anyone's life and how we all start out just terrible. We all start out sinful and full of all of these, we call them human characteristics. They're not the way humans are supposed to be, but we call them human because they're so common. And the Bible doesn't make its heroes the way fiction does a lot of times. It just tells us exactly how they were. And these 12 heroes we're talking about, 11, I don't know if Judas really counts. We're talking about Paul, 12. Matthias, 13. We'll get there. The apostles who were heroes, we see them starting out as very common, very sinful, having the same kind of problems we do. How did John become the apostle of love? Well, Jesus helped him establish an equilibrium. Usually when we're sinful, the problem is we're out of balance. For example, is anger in itself a sin? If it is, God sins because God gets angry. Is hatred a sin in itself? If it is, God's a sinner because there are 6 things the Lord hates. No, 7 are an abomination unto Him. Proverbs 6:16 through 19. The problem is when our anger gets out of balance, out of control, when our hatred gets out of balance. That's the problem. And that was John's problem. And Jesus helped him and helps us establish this this equilibrium so that other qualities can flourish and keep the harsher qualities in balance. And I'll give you 3 examples tonight of how Jesus did that for John. First, John learned the balance of love and truth. Truth was very important to John. Sometimes he spoke of it in terms of light. In him, he says of Jesus, in him was light, and the light was the life of men. He's talking about truth. He's the one that told us, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He's the one that told us, Jesus said, thy word is truth. He's the one that told us that Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And many, many other examples. In fact, John uses the term truth 45 times in his writings. There's quite a few. Turn over to 1 John. I'll give you a few examples here. 1 John chapter 1, verse 6 will be the first one. If we say we have fellowship with Him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. Now you notice how he says we don't practice the truth? He says it negatively and positively. You lie and do not practice the truth. So he's so concerned about truth that he expresses the same thing 2 different ways. Verse 8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. You see how black and white that is? You're lying, you deceive yourself, there's no truth. Chapter 2, verse 4. Whoever says, I know Him, but does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. He does this over and over again. Look at 3 John, verse 4. 3 John, verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. And I could give you many, many more examples, as I say, 45 times. He uses the word truth. Truth was very special to John. Yeah, Mark. Yeah, he starts his first epistle out like, this is what we've seen, what we've heard. We are witnesses of these things. And John's emphasis is that Jesus is the Son of God, that He's divine. And that's the truth that he seems to want people to know above all things, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And that's, John 20, 30, and 31. So that's that side I'm trying to get across. That's just another example. But in the beginning, this desire for truth was out of balance. And I'll share with you one example from Mark chapter 9. Now, Mark 9 starts out with the Mountain of Transfiguration. So you have 6 people on the Mount of Transfiguration. 2 of them are dead. They've been dead for centuries. There's Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And then who are the other 3? Peter, James, and John. John, we're talking about tonight. They come down from the mountain to see the other 9 disciples having an argument with Jesus' enemies, the scribes, about this poor man and his son who's demon-possessed. The disciples failed to cast out the demons because they were trying to do it without prayer for some reason. And the scribes are taking advantage of their failure. Jesus casts out the demon, saves the boy, and then He begins talking to His disciples. They start arguing about who's the greatest. verse 35 of Mark 9. They come to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" Now, he knew exactly what they were discussing. Peter, James, and John had been up on the Mount Transfiguration. They saw the vision. They were the only ones who had seen the vision. The other 9 were down here failing. And Peter, James, and John had settled, okay, we're the top 3. Now, between the 3 of us, who's number 1? Probably something like that was going on. And so Mark tells us they kept silent, verse 34, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Be humble. Be humble. Now look at the next verse in context. All this has transpired. Mount of Transfiguration, failure to cast out the demon, triumph of Peter, James, and John. We're the greatest. Which one of us is the greatest? Jesus says, whoever's first must be last. Become like a child. All of that happens and leads up to the only statement John makes alone, without James, in what's called the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called that because synoptic means, it's a prefix, sin or soon, which means together. Optic means to see. They see the life of Jesus together. They're more similar than John. John's gospel account was written decades after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's very different in its perspective. So this is the only statement John makes alone, without James speaking alongside of him, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So what kind of statement is it? Look, verse 38. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." Now, I've always read that as if John was trying to get somebody in trouble, or John was trying to get credit for standing up for the truth, because John has this equilibrium problem. He loves truth, but right now he seems to love truth more than he loves people. But now in context, I'm wondering, is this a confession? Is Jesus starting to chip away and bring balance in here? Look, quit arguing over who's the greatest. Whoever's first must be last. You should become like a child. Read it as a confession. I really think this is the way it should be read. Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he wasn't following us. What if he was admitting fault? We tried to stop him because he wasn't following us. And Jesus said, don't stop him. No one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterwards to speak evil of me. Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah, this is James and John, the brothers, whose mother came to Jesus, grant that they'd be on the right hand and the left hand when you come into your kingdom. He said, it's not mine to grant, but the Father. Yeah, this is one of those guys. Yeah, so there again, wanting to be the greatest. But just think about that. Could he have been making a confession? Either way, Jesus took him back a notch. I think this is an example of John's zeal for truth in overdrive. They're not walking with us. They have no business casting out demons in your name. And Jesus had to tell him, don't stop him. He's doing a mighty work in my name. Why are you making him an enemy? But he learned the balance. Truth 45 times in his writings. You know how many times the word love is found in John's writings? 80 times. 80 times. Look at 2 John 1. Let's just look at some examples. 2 John shows that balance coming out. There's a concern for truth. Verse 1, the elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth. And not only I, but also all who know the truth. Verse 4, I rejoiced greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth. But then look at verse 5. Now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. He says in verse 9, everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. So you have in 2 John this chiastic arrangement where it's truth, truth, truth. You get to verse 5, and he says in verse 5, love one another. And then he's back on truth. If a false teacher is teaching something and does not abide in the teaching of Christ, don't receive him, don't welcome him in any way. You see in there the balance, how he became the apostle of love. Any comments on the balance of truth and love? Of course, we think of a lot of expressions of Paul, like Ephesians 4:15, speak the truth in love, right? But John, he needed Christ to teach him that. We do too. Okay, let's go to a second example of balance. He learned the balance of ambition and humility. And we were in Mark 9. Let's go back to Mark chapter 10. And this revisits, Ray, the account you mentioned a moment ago when James and John came to Jesus. Their mother was making the request, but they were clearly behind it. In fact, Matthew's the one who says the mother did the talking. Mark leaves that detail out simply because it was James and John who wanted this. And so they were speaking through him. And we didn't look at Mark's account so much last week. We're going to look at it this week. Mark 10:35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said, what do you want me to do for you? And they said, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. We talked about this a lot last week, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but I think it's an illustration of John's ambition. And what did John want? He wanted to obtain the position. That's what he wanted. And look what Jesus said to him. He said, you do not know what you're asking, verse 38. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? The cup was a symbol of God's wrath. You can read it throughout the prophets. The wicked will drink the cup of God's wrath down to the dregs. And baptism is a word we know, which means to dip, to immerse, to submerge completely, or to overwhelm. And when it's used in a symbolic sense, as it is here, it means to overwhelm. And this is a baptism Jesus is baptized with. And he's not talking about the baptism of John. He's talking about his suffering. We are able, James and John say, we are able, but they did not know what they were asking. John wanted the position more than he wanted to be worthy of the position. And Jesus was saying to him, well, you don't know what you're asking. To get here, you have to drink a cup and you have to receive a baptism. The ambition had to be taken back a notch. Right? Jay, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it kind of made me think about what you said last week. The fact that there's a fairly good possibility that they were cousins to Jesus.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking, I said, that makes more sense to me now as to why they would ask that. And I almost got the feeling, too, that may have been their last shot at getting position, because they already knew what, Jesus had spoken to Peter. you make a good confession. I almost look at it too, and it's just my way of saying it. It's almost like they're trying to get that last little shot in to get themselves some prominence.
Up higher, yeah. That may have been why they sent Aunt Salome in there, maybe he won't say no to her. I don't know. But it might explain the ambition more, the boldness with Jesus, and not fully perceiving who he was at this point. They would come to that.
You also want to think about, after they asked that, it sounded a lot different in my head before I asked it.
Yeah, that happens a lot of times when we speak up. Look at 1 John 3:2, just to show the balance. I had a lot of other ways to do this, but this is enough. 1 John 3:2, this is after the transformation. Beloved, he writes as an old man to Christians, we are God's children, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him. Somebody sent me a video one time of a preacher saying that he would have a higher honor than the rest of his church in heaven because he was a higher servant of God. I said, what do you think about that? And I was kind of caught flat-footed by it, but if I could answer it now, I'd go to 1 John 3:2. This apostle who's 90-something years old, who walked with Jesus, saw the transfiguration, said, beloved, we are God's children. That's a change. That's a balance from ambition to humility. Quickly, last, he learned the balance of suffering and glory. It says that all the disciples, when Jesus was tried and arrested, deserted him. They all deserted him because they couldn't accept that the path to glory involved suffering. They just couldn't grasp that. And Peter was the most obvious. He's the one that got in Jesus' way, and Jesus had to say, get behind me, Satan. But they were all like that, even John. But Jesus taught him to balance out suffering and glory. Taught him that suffering is the path to glory. And John learned that. John was at the cross. He came back. He left. He was the quickest to learn this because he came back with Peter and was there whenever Jesus was being questioned, and they recognized Peter. Were you with him? Peter denies 3 times. But John, he's with him all the way to the cross. And we know this because when Jesus was hanging on the cross, John was the only one that he could look to and say, woman, behold thy son. And point his mother out to John and say, behold thy mother. And John was there to take Jesus' mother home and care for her, we presume, until her death. And in Revelation, we read that he's on the Isle of Patmos, not for a vacation, but because he'd been exiled for the work he had done as a bishop, an elder, a shepherd in the church at Ephesus. The Emperor Domitian exiled him to this rough island when he was in his 90s. And we presume that's where he spent the rest of his days. He learned the balance between suffering and glory, ambition and humility, truth and love. And I think John's wonderful because you just see the transformation take place before your very eyes. And it was a mark of humility that when he wrote his gospel account, he did not write it and include himself and refer to himself all the time as John. But he never mentioned himself by name. Every time he came to him and it was necessary for him to explain his role in the activities, he would always say, the disciple whom Jesus loved. But he didn't get that way overnight. That's the Apostle John. Yeah, Mark. Mm-hmm. Yeah, aren't we blessed because they did that? It'd be hard to read about these perfect people, and think there's any hope for us. That's true. Thank you for your attention tonight.